We're on. Let's start.
Oh, okay, yeah, you want me to start? Okay.
That's what you're on. Action, if you prefer.
Alright, so for our passage, it all starts during Lear's stay at Ganriel's castle. So Lear's servants and knights first realize that Ganriel's servants no longer obey their orders. So in reaction to this, Lear asks Oswald, Ganriel's steward, where Ganriel is. And the latter just leaves very rudely without responding, which prompts Lear's fool to tell Lear by way of puns and subtle innuendos that he made a big mistake by choosing to give all his power to Ganriel and Regan. So shortly after, Ganriel appears and demands that Lear sends away 50 of his knights. And this just enrages Lear, who begins to curse Ganriel for demanding something like this. And basically what happens in that passage is basically Lear curses Ganriel throughout the passage. And as a team, we have chosen to talk about the way Shakespeare chose to portray Lear's folly and the role reversal of Lear from persecutor to victim. And personally, I'll be talking about how one of the major themes present in the book, which is selfishness and egocentrism, is reflected in the character Lear in this particular passage. So from the get-go, we can already see that Lear's being a hypocrite from the first passage. He says, "Detested knight, too least, my train are men of choice and rarest parts, that all participants of duty know, and in the most exact regard support the worships of their name." So we can see here that he says that Ganriel is lying, well in fact he is the one lying, because we know for a fact that during the time where the play takes place in, knights were known to be very disrespectful and cause a ruckus. And not only that, but Lear is also disheartened by the way he is treated by Ganriel, while he in fact did something even worse to Cordelia. So while it is true that Ganriel wants to strip his father of the last bit of power he has left, she actually formulates a reasonable demand, considering the fact that the knights of Lear are actually disrupting the peace of her castle. In Lear's case, he just strips away Cordelia of her power and her privilege just because she didn't want to comply to him and over-exaggerate her love for his father like her sisters did in order to satisfy his humongous ego. So we can see that while he condemns Ganriel for treating him poorly, he in fact treats Cordelia even poorly, even worse. And so we can see that he only sees his daughters as nothing more as tools whose sole purpose is to boost up his confidence and his morale. So another point which demonstrates his egocentrism is the fact that even though he realizes that compared to Cordelia's fault, which was not to over-exaggerate her love for him, Ganriel's fault is even bigger. He does not believe he was wrong in sending her away. So this is demonstrated by the fact that he does not seek to apologize or ask for forgiveness from Cordelia. Instead, he just proceeds to curse Ganriel in the same way he cursed Cordelia. So in a sense, we can see that Shakespeare is presenting Lear as a baby in a grown man's body, because he's unable to put up with rejection and confrontation. So we can see that he is enraged about the fact that he's getting less men, but in reality it doesn't really matter because he's living in the castle of his daughter, and realistically it wouldn't change anything if he had less men. And instead of reasoning with Ganriel, he immediately starts cursing her. There's multiple explanations for this. So you can easily interpret this as the reason behind why he cannot handle rejection, as the fact that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. And so for the most part of his life, he was never challenged and he was never confronted with people who had differing points of view.
Okay, so for the two other ideas we have, for the first one we have the idea of folly in this passage. So basically Lear starts to show signs of being a crazy man, and this is practically a foreshadowing of him becoming crazy later on. So it's possible to divide this part into two, and the first one is how Lear is constantly being contradicting himself. So firstly, when he starts in the first paragraph, in the first part, when he says, "Oh, most small fault, how ugly did thou show in Cordelia show," he basically he was angry about Goneril, but he started cursing Cordelia. So it's like a confusion in his head. He doesn't know which one he's like confused between his daughters, and he doesn't know who to accuse of the crime he's being victim of. The second one, he's very unclear in his curse against Goneril. So basically, when he said that he wants Goneril to not have any children, but then later on he says that he wishes her to have the worst of every kid a mother could have. So basically here he's again contradicting himself by cursing by using opposite curses on his daughter. Secondly, Lear is also being gradually marginalized by his certainty. This is just how all madmen are like. They're being distanced from normal people. So we can see that when Albany said, "My lord, I'm guiltless, as I'm ignorant of what has moved you." And so basically here, Albany doesn't understand what is happening. And this is just like how normal people don't understand what a crazy person is talking about. Yeah. So and another example of this is when Goneril refers to his reaction as the result of his old age. When we can say this, never afflict yourself to know the cause, but he let his disposition have the scope that dotage gives it. So basically, she says that his old age is making him growing crazy, and we can think that is actually true, because just like what Zejun said, it is true that she's being reasonable here by dismissing his knights, because like what my teammate said, they are actually making a ruckus over here. The second idea in this passage is Lear has turned from persecutor into victim. And it's the turning point in this story, because he started being a persecutor for Cordelia. He's the one who sent her away, but now he is the one being persecuted by his own daughter, Goneril. Lear is the victim, and he accentuates on this role by victimizing himself even more. So basically, he's not only the victim of his daughter, but also the victim of himself. So we can see that by Lear, he never blames himself for acting badly, but accuses others or part of himself for failing him. So we can see that first part he blames Cordelia, and then he blames his folly for receiving the punishment. Like, "Oh, Lear, beat this gate and let the folly in." And he's talking to himself as if it's not himself. It's like a third person, someone else than himself. So he's blaming another Lear than himself. And most importantly, at the end of this, the passage we're given, we can see, "Old fond eyes, we weep this cause again, I will pluck you out." So now he's blaming his eyes for crying and not himself. And that's just very absurd at some point. So in conclusion, if we don't consider the rest of the story and just only this passage, it appears that Lear is more to be blamed than Goneril for his hypocrisy, his egocentric personality, his need to victimize himself by putting the blame on others in a pretty pitiful way. But the way that he's acting is yet justifiable by his age and by possible folly that is taking him up. So we can only pity him as a result. Thank you.
Okay, so the second expert, the expert that we've been assigned to, starts at line 40 and around the middle of the 11th scene of the play. So in context, Lear here was accompanied by Kent and a fool, and that's when he actually meets Edgar disguised as Tom when they were getting to the cave in the middle of what seemed like a terrible storm. So at this point, we could say that Lear is already at the borderline of what is considered, I would say, mental insanity. But really, when Edgar shows up, that's when he actually starts to think about some of the things he never actually acknowledged in the past when he was still king. Things such as how the poor of this country actually managed to survive or to shelter themselves from storms like this one. So this passage here, I think, is interesting not only because it pictures the downfall of both of the characters, but it also puts in together the fact that they meet each other at, I would say, maybe a climax of their own personal tragedies. So in this text here, they really explicitly convey some of the main themes that are present throughout the whole book. For example, the gravity of madness in relation with the forces of nature and their control on people's behaviors, as well as the question of appearance and even to some extent their personal animal side. So first of all, this passage presents like the concept of chaos, I would say, not only in a very psychological level, but as well as a very external level. So the first example we could see clearly is the fact that the weather, and here the storm, really represents the personal decay and the social decay and the breaking down of the social structures in the story. So a clear example again would be the filial bonds in the story, for example, because here, whether it's between Gloucester and his sons or between Lear and his daughters, we could see that this bond originally is supposed to be built on some kind of compassion and trust, and even to some extent duty between parent and child, but instead here in this novel it is really just instead broken down by lies and deception. So there's really is like an illogical twist of relationship going on, and as Edgar also says so in this passage, go to that cold bed and warm thee. So here I really think it really shows the ironic opposition between the two elements here in this almost like a oxymoron opposition, bringing together the first element, which is the bed, that we could associate to family, warmth, and tranquility, and shelter. And all that is being opposed to the second element, which is the cold, which is harsh and unforgiving. So that sort of gives an idea of how the story here doesn't really make sense. And also seeing that it represents the personal, the character's psychological state, it's also used as a tool of foreshadowing. For example, the fool points out in this passage, the cool night will turn us all into fools and madmen. So here we notice, for example, that the fool really explicitly shows the role of nature and how it will affect the characters in this play. So from a certain point of view, we can understand that the fool really is talking from a point of view that is not directly involved in all this madness and disaster. He's really just talking from a distance from the madness. So when Lear really decides to embrace the storm and his mental deterioration, the fool really takes on as the role of the voice of reason and stops being a fool. And once again, this really shifts towards the idea that the social orders and the structures are being broken down when in contact with nature. And finally, a last point that proves how the nature's forces really affect on the human's behavior is the presence of the symbols here, the stars and the cosmic forces. So at the beginning of this passage, we know that poor Tom keeps on mentioning what he calls the Foul Fiend, is, I would say, his personal representation of what is evil. We also understand that Foul Fiend here could be also universally understood because it only does not affect Kent. It could also be applied to Edgar. To some extent, it could also be applied to Lear and Gloucester, if it's not a bit far-fetched, saying that they're not actually innocent, but they also have, they also could be blamed for the things that are actually happening to them. So through the use of imagery, Edgar really refers to the harm that the devil did to him. He says, "Oh, poor Tom, whom the foul fiend has led through fire and had laid knives under his pillow, said rasping by his porridge." So he really does believe that some evil spirit is following him, but he is still an innocent spirit. And
Let Coralie chime in as you're running.
In our scene, there's also a strong association between humans and animals, which contrasts with the concept of civility that is represented by the Bible. King Lear and Edgar, by becoming mad, are becoming more and more like animals. At that time, clothing was an indicator of one's rank in society, and in fact, Edgar, when pretending to have been a serving man in his past, insists on his physical appearance. At 1786, he curled his hair and wore gloves in his cap. This accentuates the fact that humans are trying to distanciate themselves from animals by making up rules and acting civilized. But by becoming mad and losing his mind, Edgar lost his humanity and returned to his original state, one of an animal. Lear also reiterates this argument by saying at line 96 that unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, animal. Before this, Lear tells Edgar that a man without clothes is like a worm without silk, or a beast with no hide, and a sheep without wool, or a cat that can provide the ingredient for perfume. He's comparing to Edgar to animal to show and what they offer to society, to emphasize the fact that Edgar is more like an animal than a human. He doesn't belong to society anymore. On the other hand, this passage could mean that Lear is realizing that all men are equals and that it is only their clothes or status that differentiate them from one another. At the end of his speech, Lear takes off his clothes, which reflects his desire to leave society and become natural and true to himself. Edgar's madness is also bringing him closer to nature. The gradation that can be found in Edgar's speech at line 83 proves it. In fact, the deadly sins are enumerated in order of gravity and are each associated with a particular animal. A hog's sloth, a foxtail, a dog's madness, or a lion's prey. It shows that animals are instinctive and free, and that they don't obey rules and don't have morals. At line 68, Lear's vicious daughters are also compared to an animal, a pelican. There is an ancient fable that tells the story of a young pelican feeding on his parents' blood, and a parallel could be established between this fable and the Christ's redemption of mankind by his blood in the Bible. It shows that Goneril and Regan are taking advantage of Lear and growing stronger by making him weaker. This seemingly leads to Edgar's line, "Pillicock sat on a pillicock hill," which is a nursery rhyme. However, there is a hidden meaning. Pillicock could mean the male genitals, and Pillicock Hills would mean the female genital by association. These references to female sexuality and their association with Goneril and Regan shows that they are not portrayed as pure and innocent, and that they must be depraved to act this way. They must be corrupted to destroy their father like they did. Okay. In conclusion, this excerpt from King Lear illustrates the madness of King Lear that is reflected by the storm and Edgar's fake madness. The weather mirrors Lear's state of mind, and there are also many references to the Bible and to Christianity which represent order within society. In contrast, there are many references to animality and bestiality, which represents nature and freedom. Throughout the excerpt, Lear and Edgar are distancing themselves further and further from society, and there is a great association between physical appearance and their place amongst others.
Okay, so our extract takes place in scene 17, but it is based upon the events that take place in scene 8, where Kent orders a gentleman to deliver a letter to Cordelia for him. This letter is meant to reveal to Cordelia the bad way that Lear is treated, so that she can come and help him. Our extract presents the gentleman's testimony of Cordelia's reaction to the letter, and it gives us a lot of information about the relation between Cordelia and her emotions. Thus, we will analyze this relation and explain how it affects the overall plot of the book. Cordelia's reaction is essential to the rest of the play, since it foreshadows the French invasion and eventually her death. Now, spoiler alert, well, we've all read the book. Cordelia doesn't have a very good control over her emotions, and perhaps if she would have better analyzed the situation, it would have led to a less tragic ending. So, what exactly were the elements that led us to believe that she has poor control over her emotions? Well,
yeah, so first off, there's the euphemism of Cordelia's reaction throughout the first gentleman's response. So, as we can see in line 13, I quote, "And now and then an ample tear trailed down her delicate cheek," end quote. Now here there is a double meaning behind the tear, because first it represents Cordelia's sadness, of course, and second it represents how much she is literally teared apart. It is interesting to note how a single word, tear and tear, can be used even though they have different meanings, but how they are, and how they are used together in this context. Tears are normally small and abundant, and the first gentleman describes them as being, quote, ample, end quote. The reader is therefore moved at how small elements such as tears can literally move and a big figure such as Cordelia, the Queen of France, and how those small tears are sufficient to describe the pain that Cordelia feels, even though she is the delicate figure. And the next passage from lines 14 to 16 emphasize how Cordelia has no control over her emotions. So I quote, "It seems she was a queen over her passion, who, most rebel-like, sought to be king over her." Now, the use of antithesis between the terms of queen and king show how Cordelia is being dominated by her emotions, because Cordelia, being the Queen of France, is supposed to have some control because of the authority she exerts. However, her male counterpart, which is the king, has total control over her. And here, her emotions are uncontrollable and untamable. We can make a clear link with the theme of women and feminism here, because Cordelia can't really obtain a higher ranking in the social hierarchy of monarchy, rather than queen. However, there is still one person that has authority over her, and here it's the king. To make a link with other parts of the play, Cornwall and Albany also behave similarly, because yes, they have more power over their wives, but they don't recognize it. They don't recognize it because they don't recognize that, even if they got that power from being married to Goneril and Regan. This expands the bond between Cordelia and her emotions that we begin noticing in the very first scene, when she decides to speak the truth about how she feels to her father. These repeated acts of honesty, whether they are towards her father or herself via her emotions, can only make the reader appreciate her more, because she is portrayed as being more human.
Another element was on lines 28 and 29, and it's the repetition of the word sisters. And so I quote, "Sisters, sisters, shame of ladies, sisters." So repeating sisters following that by shame of ladies emphasizes how Cordelia weeps in the thought of her sister's actions. And it's interesting because even though Lear banished her from her family, she still feels attached to them, to Regan and Goneril as being her sisters. And it hurts her even more considering their actions than if they were just acquaintances, because now they're her sisters and it hurts her. And she does not try to think of how she could have done better if she was there. In fact, she just genuinely weeps about her sister's actions and what's happening to her father. On line 31, there's a metaphor of Cordelia's tears. So I quote, "Holy water from her heavenly eyes," end quote. This is an allusion to the godlike figure taking the form of her emotions. So that's psychological, while it shows the grace of the Savior, that's physical. There's a few elements that we should analyze, and the first one being the contrast of high heavenly water falling down to the doom of the earth. So it starts pure and it goes down to soil, and this represents, this foreshadows her imminent death, since tears can only go down. Again, tears are small, and it shows that even though she's in power, Cordelia is already predestined by the gods and by the stars on line 34, and they are literally and figuratively above humans, talking of course about the stars. Kent says, "Stars govern us, and those stars govern the human condition." And this makes the reader think about the theme of fatality and how the human condition can be determined. So the reader realizes that even though Cordelia is part of the monarchy in the pyramid of society, she is still a human and is between the grasp of the gods. On lines 43 to 48, Kent informs the gentleman about the fact that Lear will not want to speak to Cordelia because he's ashamed of having banished her. And this is really important, because if they want to overthrow the power of Regan and Goneril, they have to unite, and since both the big leaders of the the other faction can't even speak to each other, this causes a problem. And this relates to the theme of dysfunctional family, where Lear, instead of talking it out with Cordelia, just holds a grudge and is like, oh my god, I can't speak to him since I'm such, I shouldn't have done this. We personally think that Cordelia is the best. In fact, we love her the most out of all the other characters, since even after getting banished and having her diabolical sisters taking the power that was rightfully hers, she stands up and can't stand idle in the face of her father's bad treatment. And she really stands apart from all the other characters by this demonstration of righteousness.
And in conclusion, the letter proves to be a major element in the play since it introduces the French intervention in the English conflict. After having explained the relationship Cordelia has with her emotions, we are more able to understand what this relationship means for the overall plot of the play. She is determined by her emotions, making her more relatable and more human to the reader's eyes, but a real ticking bomb to the playwriter's eyes, as we saw by the fact that her emotions eventually lead to the defeat of the French army and eventually to her own death. The repeated appearances of multiple literary devices, especially the metaphors of tears, give us an idea of the effects that the letter provoked on her. The themes of feminism and dysfunctional family help extrapolate links towards other scenes in the play. Cordelia is by far one of our favorite characters, and her righteousness only makes her even more likable as a character.
Alright, so Steffi and I will be presenting the 22nd scene, which occurs right before the war between France and England, and Goneril, Regan, Albany, and Edmund are all preparing for the war. So prior to this, the readers find out that Cordelia has found her father, and during the scene, Regan will be admitting her feelings towards Edmund, and Albany learns through a letter that his wife is also attracted towards Edmund. So to analyze the scene, we will be concentrating on specific themes, specifically the inequality between sexes and social classes. So in order to do so, the two main points that we will be analyzing are how Shakespeare presents feelings of love as a weakness for Regan and Goneril, so the feelings become more powerful than their goal and overcome what they think, and the way Shakespeare represents how the lower class can also bring some knowledge to the ones in higher position. So Steffi will be also concentrating on social positions. So during the scene, the themes of hatred and jealousy are present between the two sisters, and Shakespeare portrays inequalities between men and women concerning their self-control. So women's feelings are presented as a weakness, whereas men have the power to control them. So in the beginning of the scene, Regan and Albany are talking about wars. Regan and Edmund, are talking about war strategies, but quickly she lets her feelings overcome her judgment. So Shakespeare presents women as individuals who do not have the power to control their feelings, and Regan asks Edmund if he has feelings for Goneril, so she is curious to know what the situation is. And she does not seem to care about the war anymore, and he is very wary. He thinks it is a trick question and responds with a love that can accommodate everyone. And contrary to women, as a man, he is more reasonable about the situation and knows how to answer while protecting his priorities. Whereas she is blinded by lust, which becomes her own weakness, and he stays in control. So she explicitly asks him if he has a sexual relationship with Goneril at the line 11, which is not polite for a woman of her time to ask. So there's a euphemism and a metaphor when she says, make your way to the forfended place. And she's not only implying sexual intercourse, but is also referring it to as a sin by using the word forfended, which is an archaic term for forbidden. So she is therefore disgusted and jealous by the thought of her sister even being with Edmund, especially because she is married, which is a sin. Not her being married, but her being with him. So she tries to make sure that he will not fall for Goneril and uses the word Bosomer, which is vocabulary of that era, instead of concentrating on her goal, which is to win the war and keep her position, keep her power and her high position. Furthermore, the priorities for men and women are not the same. For example, when Albany learns that his wife may be in love with Edmund, he decides to still prioritize the war and only pay attention to that idea after that he's actually won the war. Also, when he comes into the scene, Albany is the one that comes with the information concerning Cordelia and the war, and not his wife. even though his wife is present and wants to contribute to the war strategies. So at the 20th line, Goneril says that she prefers losing the battle, so losing her power, her status, and everything she's worked for since the beginning of the play, than losing Edmund because of Regan. Therefore, when Goneril and Regan arrive and they want to go to the tent with the others to talk about war strategies, she asks Goneril to come with them in order to not to leave her alone with Edmund. So even when planning to speak about the war strategies, she lets her emotions guide her and does not even trust her sister. At the end of the scene, Edmund contemplates which women he will choose after he has won the war, and so he acts as if he has a choice, unlike the women that are running after him and trying to convince him. So at the 60th line, he says, each jealous of the others are as the stung are of the adder. So no matter which woman he picks, it is a lose-lose situation for them, because it will only create even more rivalry and jealousy between the sisters. And so Shakespeare therefore makes the audience think that men have the upper hand in this situation, for it is a win-win situation for him. He will just gain power throughout each choice that he could possibly make. He is hungry for power, which is a recurring theme throughout the entire play. So finally, Shakespeare presents women as individuals that cannot oppress their feelings, but are guided by them. Men, on the other hand, have more self-control and do not let their feelings get in the way of their goal, their power, which in this case is to win the war and take Lear's position. So the feelings for women create jealousy, our weakness, and the theme of power is recurring throughout the whole play, and which explains why the majority of the characters are male.
So now we will be analyzing how Shakespeare presents how the poor can detain the truth. So social hierarchy was of great importance in the 17th century, and this aspect is really reflected through the play. First of all, in line 29, Edmund says to the Duke of Albany, "Sir, you speak nobly." As we know, the Duke of Albany is rich and powerful since he has control over the kingdom. The fact that Edmund uses the adverb nobly to describe the way Albany speaks is a hint that the richer people, who are higher positioned individuals, have a different and better education, and that we can see that through the way they express themselves. And while we are exposed to the social superiority of Albany, we are introduced to some individual social inferiority in line 32, where Goneril refers to the servants as domestic poor particulars who are not to question here. The connotation of the word poor, which is synonymous with miserable here, and how she says that they are not to question, makes the audience feel the disdain towards the poorer in Goneril's tone, and how she doesn't treat them as normal humans, which is opposed to how Edgar treats the rich Duke of Albany, for example. Another example is when Edgar, disguised as poor Tom and representing the lower social class in this case, tells Albany in line 42 that to open his letter instead of telling him to open his letter. This abbreviation is Shakespeare's way of showing the audience that the poorer express themselves in a more efficient and more importantly in a less sophisticated way than the richer people do. What follows in lines 43 and 44 is Edgar saying that if Albany has victory, let the trumpet sound for him that brought it. He says that because he has the letter that contains the truth about Goneril and Edmund. So the letter here is a symbol of power. In fact, the poor Tom is in possession of the truth, so he has the power to bring victory to Albany. And there's also a metaphor that follows in lines 45 and 46 where Edgar says, "I can produce a champion," which reinforces that idea that he can bring victory to Albany and that he has power over him. These examples of how the poor detains the truth, which gives him power over the richer, suggest that Shakespeare wants to defy our perception of the social hierarchy. It is explained that we humans have the tendency to have a Manichaean perception of the world, which makes us associate good qualities with richer people. Except when a character is richer, we have the tendency to think that he's smarter, wiser, having more abilities in discerning, while we have the tendency to associate poorer characters with less education and less intelligence. So Shakespeare had the intention of thinking outside the box and doing a reversal of roles, making us see that the poor one and the rich one are both able to see, but that the poor Tom that we think is less educated and less valuable as a human because of social hierarchy is actually the one who really sees what's going on, who really possesses the truth, how Albany is being betrayed by his wife. And but let's not forget that poor Tom looks uneducated, but he is actually the Earl of Gloucester's son, so he comes from a wealthy and noble environment. So is there really a reversal of roles? I think it's Shakespeare's objective to confuse us here, to make us ask, does Shakespeare want to show us that the poor Tom that is supposedly less educated is the one detaining the truth, or the rich Hedgar hiding behind the poor figure is the one detaining power? So in brief, Shakespeare confuses us by at first implying that knowledge can only be detained by rich people and more powerful people, but then associating power of truth with a character who appears to be poor but is in fact from a wealthy environment. So Shakespeare portrays inequality, in conclusion, between men and women, mainly due to self-control and how each one deals with their feelings. Women's feelings are presented as a weakness that gets in the way of their goal, whereas men have more power and strategy. And Shakespeare presents another layer of inequality between the higher and the lower social classes. On the first hand, we see that the poorer people can actually be in possession of power by knowing more than the richer, but at the end we realize that the one we perceive as being poor is in fact wealthy too. In general, the rich is still associated with knowledge. Thank you.
Free for all.
Okay, so I had a question for the first team. So you guys say that Lear becomes crazy because of his old age and that he becomes crazy by himself. However, isn't it his two daughters that play games with him because of the Salter situation that make him go crazy, and they're also the ones that bring up the fact that he is going crazy because of his age? So it's like they're imposing all of the crazy thoughts in his head and pushing him towards that lifestyle?
Well, to respond to that, we can say that he is not completely crazy yet, but we can see that in the first part of the story, he's still pretty clear, but he starts already to show like signs of contradictions in his speech, but also he is not really knowing what he's doing, because he, let's say when he talks about the very small fault of Cordelia, but he actually banished her from the country. So basically we can really say that he's not really clearing what not really clear in his thoughts, not in what he's actually doing, and he's just trying to be a steward-born old man, trying to keep his pride as a king, as a former king, and that's the sign of his madness.
Yeah, and I have something to add to that. The first weird and crazy action did in the book, well, in the play, was actually Lear giving out his power to his daughters. This never happens. A king is not supposed to let their power go unless they die. So I think that all the madness that ensued was created by that.
So I have a question for you. So you talk about how the fact that because Cordelia shows her emotions so much that she's the most relatable character and your favorite character. But when you say that the fact that she exemplifies such high values and that she's so unrealistic, even though she gets betrayed by her father and her sisters, she still wants to help them. Don't you feel like it's so unrealistic that you just can't relate something so perfect? So
Well, yeah, of course she represents an ideal. An ideal of hope, she's idealist, yeah. She wants to help her family, she's strongly attached to her family bonds, but I think that it just makes her likable. You see someone.
But she's not real. You cannot she's not real. She's unrealistic. It's unrealistic expectations, rom-coms.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but I think that it's just to see a person that would do the right thing in even the worst situation just brings it makes us think about humanity and reflects on and think what if everybody did this? Would the world be a better place? Well, I think yes, it does, and that's why Cordelia is one of my favorite.
Well, it's like communism. If everybody was for sharing things, it'd be perfect. But nobody wants to share things.
Yeah, well, in communism's examples, nobody wants to.
Yeah, but it's an ideal. It's an ideal. Yeah, same thing as Cordelia.
Yes. normally, normally artists or authors or movie producers, they try to portray a perfect character that could serve as an example for the audience, and so that the readers or the audience of the play could see that in that situation, which one of the sisters acted the best. So was it the sisters that completely destroyed the family bonds, or was it the daughter that stayed by her father's side and tried to help everyone out? So maybe Shakespeare's trying to show an image or show an example that he thinks, from his point of view, in that era, in that context, would be the best way to act towards.
I have another question to ask you. When wishing sterility upon his own daughter, don't you what does it say about women, how women are portrayed in King Lear?
Okay, so basically we thought that we have thought of this as a representation, but we didn't have enough time to present it. What we thought is here we can say that women during that period is determined by their child, like how their child is successful, and
How their what?
how their children are successful. Because if you give birth, if your son or your daughter is really successful as a mother, you're really successful. But here, when King Lear, he swears on his daughter to say that you will not have a successor, or that your kid should be the worst of all kids. Well, he's just trying to say that the best punishment for a woman is to make her not have a child, or possibly have the worst child possible, and that's probably like a feminist point of view.
Don't you think also that maybe he wants to emphasize the fact that in this society, women are only like useful because they can carry a child, and that without that, gonorrhea is like useless to society?
What you want to see, like, what you were trying to say is like, in this play, women are portrayed as the weaker sex. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just feel like there's kind of a contradiction, because as we talked about earlier, Cordelia is presented as this ideal, and she's a woman. So I don't feel like there's really a will from Shakespeare's part to present women as the weaker sex.
But
Like you said, Cordelia is not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it can really like show how at that time women were treated in society.
But like also about the fact that you talk about like how women are success is attributed to the fact that you have a son or like a good daughter.
Usefulness.
Yeah, usefulness. But we can also see that for men too, it's really important to have a good son or a good daughter. And you can see this through Gloucester, who because Edmund, who's a bastard, and Gloucester just doesn't like him as much as Edgar, which prompts Edmund to frame Edgar for the murder, for him being attacked.
I just want to add to that even when women are in positions of power, we see that they let themselves be controlled by their feelings. So even when they're supposed to be useful other than for carrying a child, they're portrayed as being unuseful. And I just want to go in another way too. I noticed that there's an important theme of the lack of individuality that is portrayed in the scenes 4 and 11. So in scene 4, when King Lear says, "My train are men of choice," I see that there's an aspect of gregariety that is obvious to the expression "my train," where he sees his knights as just a bunch of people, but he doesn't consider each one of them. So they're simply his servants that are inferior to him, and each of them is not an individual human that deserves to be treated. They're just treated as human as him. They're just a train of people. And also in scene 11, when it says that unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor barefoot animal as thou art, I think that like Coralie said, yes, he's not dressed and he's different from the rest of the society. So when you're individual, you seem you're a failure. In other words, you need to be like the rest of the society to dress like the rest of the society. You need to be civil, as Coralie said. When you're individual, you're not part of society and you're a failure. So.
And to add a point on what Stephanie just said, Edmund's mom is never mentioned. in the whole play, and it shows how, like you said, when you're an individual that does not conform to the society, when you carry a child outside of marriage, you are rejected of society, and you are, like in the play, not even mentioned, and you are not even worth the mention of the mother. And yes, that leads to the bastard son, Edmund, to commit horrendous acts, and that furthermore proves how having a heir that is successful is the goal of my mother, like you guys.
Okay, just to come back to the women thing from the first team. Actually, I just wanted to say, I feel like, yes, at that time in society, women are pictured as the less important gender, the one with less power, but it is also from not just that we determine if if the woman is actually a better person or a worse person. Like, I feel like one of the main differences between like two of the main women characters in the play, Goneril and Cordelia, is that they really have a difference in their way of perceiving their priorities. Like, you could see that Goneril really has a messed up sense of priority, like Magali said earlier. Goneril really doesn't mind like not winning the war, but she definitely wants to win Edmund, which is a clear sense that already puts her underneath Cordelia, which at the beginning Cordelia didn't really mind the fact that she was perceived as someone her father turned away to, but because she is actually prioritizing the well-being of her father. And I really think in women, that's really the decisions and the things you do that's really determining your placement in society.
So I have a question for Karadi. So you said like Lear became, during your passage, Lear became free by becoming an animal, but do you really believe he's more free because in a sense after he becomes an animal he just becomes crazy and he has no more control over his emotions and he just goes on and on about how her daughters betrayed him?
I think it depends how you like define the word free. I think because like he doesn't obey to society's rules and he can do what he wants, but it's of course he can't because his daughters are forcing him to live outside in the storm and use all his powers.
Can I add to that? So just you guys see that Lear becomes an animal, but already in the beginning we see that he's so impulsive and he does what he wants already, which was your definition of animals in this. It's instincts and free. And in the beginning, when he sees that Cordelia does not love him like he wants to, he's impulsive. He doesn't think about the future, which like humans should. And just to answer also to Zejun, for some people, power makes them free. So as you can see for Goneril and Regan, what makes them think they're free is when they're at the high top of the position.
I was talking about Lear.
I know, but I'm bringing it back to other characters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
since Goneril was ready to sacrifice her whole army just to get Edmund, would you say that this would mean she loses some like a position in society, but still remains in power? Well, and doesn't have as much power, but feels more free since she's with Edmund?
Well, as we saw, like both of our teams spoke about how their feelings and emotions control their actions, and I would say she thinks that power makes her more free, but she's willing to sacrifice it, and on the basis of like, love. But as you can see, I don't think their relationship between Edmund and the two sisters is actually love, but it's more lust or the want of something that they can't